Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week, I'm happy to say my stress level is way down as I've taken a job that I'm absolutely stoked on. While I've already started, I'm going to share all the details next week after I have some office time under my belt. While doing two jobs will be time-consuming, I'm genuinely excited about both things, and my family is 100% covered with great insurance, which is the most important thing given what my family's going through right now. What I will share this week was how fun the first Snowvana ski show was in Seattle. It was the first time in years that we've had a great show with tons of exhibitors, brands, and most importantly, customers who are taking advantage of all the great deals to be had. So much product was moved. I was on the mic, and if you've ever been to an event that I MC, you know that it's totally different from my podcast voice, and I bring so much energy and humor to the table. Like always, I landed a few more MC jobs out of this one, and really, live events are what I do best. And the next one I do is in early December for the High Fives Foundation Silver Tie Gala, which I was invited back to again this year. If you have an event and you spend a lot of money on making that event great, don't do what a lot of people do and not hire a great MC. Believe me, everyone notices, and while you can do everything right, skimping on the part that everyone is forced to hear, well, that can make what should be a great event turn into an average one, or worse, a joke. That's enough about me and events. Right now, the snow is starting to fall and mountains will be opening any day, which means that it's time to get back after it. If you haven't started getting your ski legs out of office mode, well, you should start soon. Speaking of office mode, everyone knows that I spent 15 years at K2, which is now the Elevate Outdoor Collective. And there's been some changes over there that I want to talk about. First, they let go of their CEO. And while the press release says that he left to pursue other ventures, I talked to a handful of Elevate employees, and they all used the language, "let him go." So I'm not going to believe the press release. There's new leadership there, and I'm so excited it's a woman for the first time ever. My guess is there'll be less micromanaging, and people will be able to do their jobs right without having to think about pleasing people internally. I mean, if you look at it, K2's turned into a boot company that also makes skis. And in the future, I bet they'll get back to focusing on what they do best, selling skis. I doubt they'll ski as good as my Elan ripsticks, but whatever. New leadership and increased morale can do a whole lot. What else is interesting is the Marker, DeBello, and Vocal teams are now headquartered out of Elevate's new Factoria headquarters. While the legacy folks working in other places will still be doing that, I'm willing to bet that all the new hires will report to work in the new digs just outside of Seattle. Who would have thought Vocal headquarters would be in Seattle 25 years ago? Crazy. But at the end of the day, all of this is great news, and it'll be fun watching K2 get back to its old glory and cohabitate with other brands like Line and Vocal. And while Line developed a snowboard and has gotten so much press around that lately, I'm not going to talk about it. That's my industry news for now. You aren't here for industry news from me, though. You're here for another legendary guest and great podcast, and I have both for you. Lou Dawson is looked at as the pioneer of backcountry skiing in the U.S. He's the first person to climb and ski all of Colorado's infamous 14ers, and he was an absolute animal in the mountains. These days, he's a little older, a little wiser, and while he still gets out there, Lou's also known as a writer of guidebooks, the founder of wildsnow.com, and so much more. His memoir, Avalanche Dreams, is out now and is the perfect gift for anyone who loves being in the mountains. Before we talk about Lou's incredible life and times, I want to ask you to tell a friend about the show. It really does help get more ears on this living and breathing history of sport that I'm creating. I'd also love for you to star rate me on iTunes and Spotify. And if you want, write me a review. I'll read the best ones each week in my outro. Thanks for doing that. Thanks for coming back every week. And most importantly, thank you for listening to my sponsor ads and buying their products. I only work with the best. And they are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Best Day Brewing, Thermic and Dissent Socks, and Stanley. Now, it's time to talk with Lou Dawson. I'm going to start this one out in Aspen. It's 1982. You and your buddy John Isaacs, aka Izzo, were going to join the Highlands Bowling League by climbing Highland Bowl and skiing the gnarliest line, B1. That area was closed. What happened back then if you got caught?
Well, it's Izzo. It's just a nickname for John Isaacs. But yeah, the Highland Bowl area if you're familiar at all with Aspen, is kind of iconic now because they opened up, this steep alpine bowl as part of the ski resort. Back in 1982, that was closed. It was part of the ski area permit area, but it was never open to the public. And when you lived in Aspen, that thing just hung there in the sky, and it was just a huge temptation. So a lot of people, well, not a lot, but there was a crew of somewhat outlaw skiers that would head up there periodically and poach it. And Izo and I were part of that crew now and then. It wasn't my life goal or anything to do it, but, it was part of the whole temptation of what you had available out in the mountains around there. So anyway, we got going really early in the morning to avoid the ski patrol, and the sheriff's deputy, they would sometimes install at the bottom of the drainage that came out of the bowl to catch the poachers. And we were kind of in a hurry, but mostly at that point in my life, I didn't have as good a handle on controlling the amount of risk I was taking in the mountains. I was pretty reckless, I think you could say. And John, we were the same age approximately, and he was similar as a young guy. And, we just wanted to get up there and ski powder, and figured if we didn't see any avalanche activity in the area that we were good. So John started down, made a few turns, went off over on the rocks next to the run. And I started down and made a few turns and immediately felt a bunch of depth hoar layers under my skis that felt really scary. If you know anything about Colorado, you know that we get these layers of depth hoar crystals that are super unstable.
Yep.
And in those days with the skinny skis, you would tend to punch down into those layers very easily. So you knew they were there. It wasn't like you were skimming over it with modern wider skis. But anyway, I felt that layer, stopped and looked over at Izo. And at that moment, the slope fractured and dropped me down Highland Bowl in a fairly large powder avalanche.
When everything settles, are you buried? Are you conscious? What does that look like?
Well, it was a violent ride. I came to rest at the bottom of the steep part of the bowl, which is, I don't know, it's not a huge amount of vertical. It's like 1,200 or something. It's not like the 3,000 vertical foot ride that would kill anybody. But anyway, I had a broken femur on my one leg and then a broken hip bone on the other leg.
Jeez.
And was buried basically up to my neck, and my head kind of crusted over with snow. And I could look up the slope where Izo was, and I could see him working his way down the avalanche path, doing his beacon search, kind of looking at his beacon and stuff. At first way up there, but he got closer and closer. He couldn't see me because I was kind of covered with snow and kind of buried, And finally, he did see me and ran up to me and started digging me out of the snow and doing as much first aid as you can do in a situation like that, which really isn't much.
A broken femur is serious. People die from injuries like this. So Izo goes for help, but help's already on its way. Can you describe how lucky you were that day?
Yeah, this is either luck or a blessing or both, however you want to term it. But there's a mountain above Aspen where there's a lot of higher end residential houses now that has a really good view of the bowl. It's called Red Mountain. And there was a guy up there named Bob Liemacher, whose hobby was using a telescope and watching skiers over on the slopes, such as Highland Bowl and Highlands and Aspen Mountain. And Liemacher, coincidentally, had skied the bowl the day before on invitation from the ski patrol. They'd actually done some heli skiing. They'd got a helicopter and they were lifting people up to the top and skiing the POW. And Liemacher was looking at his tracks from the day before. He's telescoping his tracks, which I write about in the book. And he's glassing, and he gets up to the top of the mountain with his telescope, and there's these two guys up there. And it was really quite early. I don't remember the exact time, but it was early enough to where he was really surprised to see anybody up there. But he immediately knew what was going on, that we were poaching the bowl. And so he kept his telescope on us and watched as this whole event happened. And as he saw the avalanche take me away, he immediately picked up the phone and dialed 911. That triggered a rescue that was, an hour, maybe 2 hours faster than Izo would have been able to invoke it. because he had to climb up out of the bowl to the ski area. And then he would have had to ski down the ski area, find a phone, the whole 9 yards. Instead, when he climbed up to the resort boundary where the ski lift was, there was already a rescue being staged by the ski patrol.
You can't get any luckier than that, or like you said, something from above just happened for you, which is amazing. But I would think when you're young and you're an elite mountain climber at that point and you know a lot of the terrain traps, but you maybe get complacent, who knows what happens, but you get in that situation. And afterwards, after all of this happens, how does that event change the way you approach the mountains from here on out?
Well, I'd had some other bad experiences. I'd broken my leg pretty bad a few years prior, and I hadn't done well with that. I'd fallen into a depression and kind of compromised myself as an athlete. But I was really coming back, and I'd done some pretty big ski traverses through our local mountains, and then got onto highlands and had that happen. When that happened, I really, well, I guess you could call it counted my blessings. I really thought, wow, this is really something that I survived this, because I knew how risky a broken femur was. I've had a lot of first aid training as a guide, that sort of thing.
Yep.
And, I pretty much didn't make some kind of great proclamation to change my style or change my life, but I definitely embarked on more of a reasonable approach to the mountains and wanting to learn as much about them as I could, and spending a lot more time learning about avalanche safety, and also just thinking a lot and philosophizing about risk sports and, where the value was in those sports as opposed to the pitfalls of those sports. And, basically a classic process of self-examination, I guess you could call it. A lot of people go through that with these kind of things, almost a foxhole conversion to maybe a more spiritual outlook on life, or more philosophical.
All right. Well, I wanted to start with something that would draw us in, and that sure did. But you're not born in Aspenite. You're born in New Jersey, then you moved to Texas at like age 5. And while Texas isn't the mountains, people don't build the life that you've had on a foundation of high school football in Texas. What was your Texas outdoors experience like?
I like the reference to football, because I have to say I do respect the Texas high school football culture.
It's crazy, man. They have stadiums bigger than some colleges.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But anyway, my father was an outdoorsman. And in the days we were in Texas, our family was pretty tight. We had some problems later on that you might get into.
Yep.
But when we were in Texas, things were going pretty well with our family. And my father just loved the outland. He loved to cruise around Texas and check out the lakes and the creeks and this and that. And we'd head down to Big Bend National Park, where there are mountains, and hike those mountains. So I had mountain experience even during the Texas days.
Okay.
I gloss over it a bit in my book. But the main thing is my father was an armchair mountaineer and had a collection of mountaineering books. So while we were in Texas, I was reading these books. I became an avid reader at an early age, and I was glued to these books. I just loved the stories about these guys up there in the mountains, tackling these big hills in the Himalaya and that sort of thing. And for a young teen or a preteen, I fantasized about becoming that climber. And it gradually grew on me, and that really set my life path right there, was to become a mountaineer, a ski mountaineer or a climbing mountaineer, either way.
And your dad had ski mountaineer roots. I guess he was part of the 10th Mountain Division, but that didn't really last that long. I mean, it sounds like your dad was like a total rebel for his time, like part counterculture, part maybe non-government. And there's like a whole Cuban Missile Crisis story, which I can't remember because I read that in the book like a few weeks ago. But what was that story? Because it made me take a note about it.
Well, my father, yes, he was a complex man, as you can say about a lot of people. And he was troubled in some ways, I think. I get into that in the book because it's a memoir and he's my father, and that's a pretty standard theme for this sort of memoir, and I didn't want to avoid it. But he was at Camp Hale in Colorado as a member of the 10th Mountain Division, private, in the summer of 1943 on into the winter of 1943-44. But in the spring of 1944, he deserted and left Camp Hale and tried to escape to Mexico.
Huh.
And this was in the middle of World War II, where deserting from the Army was a serious business.
Patriotism was a lot different back then, too.
Yeah. So they caught him, and he was in jail for a year and a half.
Oh, wow.
In Fort Leavenworth military prison. So this was a mixed deal, that was so serious that you can't really make much light of it as him being just a rebel. There was something more going on because there were more than 10,000 other men who stuck with that and went into combat and heroic combat in Italy. So, it was one of these deals where the family is a mix of the positive and the negative, as it almost always is.
But your dad, he had a love of the mountains, and it sounded like while he might have had those experiences with the 10th Mountain Division and eventually went to jail for that, he still loved the mountains and still passed that along to you, first through books, but then he organized groups of Texas kids and took them to Colorado to climb mountains back in like the 60s?
Yeah, because he really was into mountains. The books that he collected prove that, and his compulsion to get down to Big Bend and explore Texas and that sort of thing. And then he had a high school friend that lived in Aspen, and he was in the mid-60s, let's say. He got bored with the work he was doing in Texas, which was working for a developer, and he kind of took up photography, and he was trying to be a professional photographer and some things like that. But he also decided he would take preteen boys, what would you call it, a mobile camp, a mobile boys camp. He wanted to do with small groups.
Okay.
So he built a homemade camping trailer, a big plywood box that had sides that folded out and you could get your gear out and that sort of thing. And then by talking it up in the neighborhoods around where we lived, he rounded up, I think it was probably 12 boys or 10 boys. And he piled them all into his international travel and towed this trailer and went up to the Aspen area and basically camped in the mountains with these kids and did this mobile camp. And during the mobile camp, which of course I was the oldest of four brothers and I always got to go on these trips, and we hiked and fished and just hung around campsites and carved things with our pocket knives, whatever boys do, or any kid, when they get out in the hills like that. But anyway, it was during those trips, I think it was 1969. No, it was way earlier than that.
61's when you climbed your first mountain.
Yeah, 1960s. But that was when I climbed my first mountain, was during those trips. And some little bump, it was not even a 13er, but above timberline, so it felt like a mountain and had a good view between here and Leadville, for those that are familiar with Colorado. And I remember it really well, and it turned out it was definitely a peak experience, no pun intended. And my father even took a really nice picture of me and these three other kids up there on this mountain. We lashed up a cross out of our walking sticks and stuck it in a cairn of rocks. For some reason, we figured that's what you did when you climbed a mountain.
Was it one of those things where when those trips would end and you would head back to Texas, it was just like, maybe not depression, but just a total bummer when you had to go back to the flatlands of Texas and you were just dreaming about being in the mountains in Aspen?
Well, it wasn't a total bummer, but I can tell you that I wanted to get back there. And I remember feeling that way. But we lived on the outskirts of Dallas in the countryside, and there was plenty to do for kids that wanted to wander around and get crazy. And it was Texas type stuff, but it was fun. I had one really good friend whose brother was really into explosives, for example.
Okay.
So
you guys blew a lot of shit up?
We probably would have been, arrested nowadays, but in those days it was kind of acceptable to make a pipe bomb and blow up an old wrecked car or something like that. I'm exaggerating, but it was basically glorified firecrackers, let's say. But there were other things, like I describe in the book. My father was working at being a professional photographer, which he never had great success with, but he tried very hard and worked really hard at it. And he did get some assignments, and one of them was covering the Sweetwater Rattlesnake Roundup, which is an event in Sweetwater, Texas, a bit of a drive out of Dallas, where basically the Chamber of Commerce of the town organizes this rattlesnake hunt. But the idea is to catch these live rattlers and bring them in to the central organizing place of the event, where they put the rattlers in this giant, dry, portable swimming pool. And then the snake wranglers wander around in there and pick up the snakes and milk them for their venom so they can make anti-venom for hospitals and clinics to have on hand. Meanwhile, everybody's hunting these snakes, and the way they do it is they spray gasoline in crevices in these rock outcrops and stuff where the rattlesnakes live. They come slithering out, and then they all grab them with these snake sticks and put them in these bags and bring them back into Sweetwater, where they judge the snakes by length and weight and who knows what. So they have some winners and that kind of thing. But anyway, my dad took a lot of photos of the snakes, and then I don't know how this happened, but he decides that it's okay if we bring 3 of them home with us as pets. And this is exactly the good side of my father.
Oh, that's so funny.
I don't care how troubled he was or whatever. This is one of the better events in life. But in any case, I had these 3 pet rattlesnakes at home. So I can mention one thing, and you'll imagine what happened next. It's called show and tell.
Oh, no.
Well, in those days, we had in school, it was grade school still. They always had show and tell, and I hated it. I'm shy, and I didn't like getting up in front of the class and talking about my pocket knife or something. So I decided I would bring the rattlesnakes to show and tell, put them in a glass aquarium with an old sheet of plywood for a cover, brought them in there, and it was the hit of the year. Every kid in Texas knows what a rattlesnake is, and, they can kill you. So to be able to go right up to the glass and tap on it and have these rattlesnakes strike the glass and try to get at you was the ultimate thing for a bunch of kids. Anyway, that didn't last long because the school officials found out we had these poisonous vipers in the classroom. And they called the sheriff. The sheriff came, and then they called my father, and he came and got me. And the rest is history. I took the snakes home, and they reached their sad demise, we'll say.
Now it's time for my first sponsor break, and when the temperature goes nuclear cold, I don't hit the mountain without my Thermic heated socks. They are the original heated sock, and still the industry leader after 20 years. It's a total game changer. Trust me, if your feet aren't working properly because they're frozen, you're not skiing or snowboarding at your best. And I make sure that doesn't happen by always wearing my Thermic socks, and this year they're better than ever. Thermic's new Smart Elastic Technology heated socks are a world's first for heated socks. These set socks are a high-performance fitting, thin ski sock where the patented heat components have stretch rather than a big, cumbersome heat band and element. So they literally feel like you're wearing your normal favorite pair of performance socks. But if heat isn't for you, don't worry. Thermic has you covered with socks for winter with their athlete-tested and proven Dissent line of socks. Some of you might be blessed with feet that never give you issues, but most of us aren't, and that's where Dissent Labs comes in. They've engineered performance socks with the help of an elite athlete team to eliminate things like chafing and heel blisters in your boots when you're touring or splitboarding. For over a decade, the people at Dissent have been making socks that are consistently the best thing you can put on your feet before you get out there. They have a distinctive locked-on fit that never seems to change. At the end of the day, Thermic and Dissent socks are the go-to socks for people that know. Drop into your local boot fitter and retailer and you'll see what I mean. Next up, it's Elan Skis. And while I've been talking about Elan all summer, I've been keeping some information from you that I'll share today. The award-winning ski that started Elan's cult following here in the US, the Ripstick, is brand new for 24-25. Think all new molds, all new sizes, new widths, and new tech. I got to ski these skis last season, and I'll say, the new models are still lightweight, they still have a ton of pop, and they'll still make you a better skier. But these new skis are even more stable at speed, which will allow them to handle burlier terrain than ever before. While you get more out of the Ripstick collection, Elan was able to build them without making them more demanding. So Ripstick fits even more skiers than before. While I loved my original Ripstick, what I skied last year was noticeably more fun, and I know the cult of Elan is going to grow even more with this new collection. If you're a person that demo skis and you haven't tried an Elan yet, make sure you try one this year and you'll feel how fun these skis are. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, and if you haven't been hearing a lot about Stanley lately, you must be living under a rock. Sure, you used to know them for keeping your grandpa's coffee hot in that signature green bottle, and they still make that, but Stanley absolutely blew up in 2023, and everybody is still talking about them. I've been telling you about how incredible their products are at keeping your drinks hotter and colder than anyone else for 7 years now. I mean, they invented the category in 1913, and while they've always done well, The world now knows that if you don't have a Stanley, you don't have the best, and I love having the best. I personally use Stanley pint glasses every single day, and I swear by them. And my wife and so many others out there can't live without their Stanley quenchers. Recently, I've integrated Stanley food storage devices into my ski routine. Instead of buying $20 burgers at the mountain, I buy food and it stays piping hot in our Stanleys, and I end up saving at least $70 a week by not buying food. While that's cool, Stanley really has something for everyone, and you can check out all their amazing products over at stanley1913.com. Those are my sponsors. Now, let's jump back into the podcast. Your family eventually moves from Texas to Aspen in 1966, and while you had done some climbing and adventuring with your dad and other people, I'm sure, your first solo hike in the mountains was in Aspen, and you came home late, your folks were freaking out, and that almost resulted in a search party looking for you. Is that how you ended up for the Ashcrofters Mountaineering School boys camp? So you could learn how to survive out in the elements?
Yeah, that had a lot to do with that. Yeah, I went for this hike where we built our house outside of Aspen, and there was a mountain, and I decided I wanted to climb it because that's what you did when there were mountains on hand, right? So, yeah, it was just a hike, but up pretty high. And I left late in the day, didn't bring much stuff, and I had no experience. Told my mother and father I was going hiking up towards the mountain, but I didn't really explain my goal. So I got up there, and it was late, and as I hiked back down, darkness fell. And by the time I got home, it was pitch dark, and my mother had already called the sheriff, and the mountain rescue team was assembling with a lot of guys. Even in those days in Aspen, they had a good rescue team. For searches like that, especially when kids were lost in the woods, they would just gather and start looking, So that showed my parents that I was pretty serious about this endeavor. And coincidentally, but serendipitously, there happened to be the Ashcrofters Mountaineering School up the road from our house. And that was a no-brainer. Basically, my parents and my grandfather, actually, who was pretty influential in my family, decided, hey, if this kid's so obsessed with doing this stuff, he better get some training. So here's the place to get started. They enrolled me and I went to the summer program. It was awesome. Rock climbing some 14ers. It was full on.
And your grandfather, he knows that the Ashcrofters Mountaineering School was great for you, but he knows that you need even more than that to be safe in the mountains because he knows you're bit by the bug. And I think he's the reason that you ended up in the NOLS program. And it's Paul Petzold, I believe is his name, but he had a huge impact on your life from an early time in high school, an influential time. And can you describe the impact him and NOLS had on you back then?
Yeah, so this thing with these mountaineering schools was obviously a really positive and beneficial in a lot of different ways. So once the Ashcrofters was done, a year went by, or I guess 2 years probably, and I told my family that I really did want to be a climber. So my grandfather, especially, was really into education. He decided, well, if my grandchild's going to do this stuff and education is important, well, let's find out where the real educator is. So he landed right on the National Outdoor Leadership School, which in those days was directed by Paul Petzold, who was the founder, along with a couple other guys. But Paul was kind of the spearhead. And Paul was, by that time, even then, he was, his late 50s or early 60s. And he was very much a father figure for those of us younger guys that ended up at NOLS. And he was a font of mountaineering wisdom. He'd do these lectures with really tons of great one-liners and stories about his days in the mountains and that sort of thing. So I got involved with NOLS as I was a student first, and then got invited on the instructor training they did and became a NOLS instructor.
When you start with NOLS, in the beginning, I'm sure you experienced the beginning of suffering through that program. But when you get home, it sounds like your home life, just living in your house, was suffering in itself. What was the whole dynamic at home, and why was that difficult?
Well, my parents, when they lived in Dallas, and as their life progressed, they really liked the idea of the beatnik sort of culture. Jack Kerouac, Dharma bums, on the road, that's that type of stuff.
Okay.
So when they got to Aspen, well, let's go backwards for a sec. The culture in Texas wasn't very conducive to that kind of, I don't know what you call it, that ethos.
That hippie lifestyle, maybe?
Yeah, and we call it hippie now. So when we moved to Aspen, they enmeshed themselves in this much more libertine, hedonistic culture there. which had its upside. You know, it was just super cool. Everybody was into the mountains and skiing and that sort of thing. But, you know, at the same time, you had the hippie movement's downside, which, you know, when it started in the Haight area of San Francisco and the Summer of Love and all that was great, which I think was, 1967. But as the couple of years rolled, there was a downside to the whole hippie thing, and that was the substance abuse. And that seemed to be a lot of fun and really great at first, but as we all know, you just can't keep doing that stuff without it affecting you.
Right.
And it affected the whole hippie movement, and it affected my parents' lives in Aspen, and it affected our family in a lot of different ways that I don't want to get into too much detail on. So when I was working for NOLS, this was going on, and I was really troubled by the whole thing. And, and I was trying to involve myself and be positive and have fun. So to an outsider, it might have looked like we were all just yucking it up, and running around with our long hair and being hippies. And it had its upsides. I won't deny it, but it wasn't that conducive to a strong family life.
No, I can see that.
So my parents, they grew apart pretty quickly. And I have 3 brothers. One was quite a bit younger. And they kind of just abandoned the parenting part of the deal, which didn't affect me hugely because by then I was getting myself out of the house. I was, 19, 20, 21. But my youngest brothers, it really affected them. There were some challenges about that weren't very pretty.
That sucks for them to have to grow up with it. And it sounds like at that time too, like when you're in high school and stuff, you definitely are smoking weed and doing drugs and stuff like that. But eventually, like right around the time that the draft comes up, your buddies start shooting drugs, which you see and you're like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that. So that's kind of when your drug use tails off for a period back then. But this is during Vietnam. People, just like you were being drafted, did you have to register? And how scary is that for a kid? Because I can't imagine.
Yeah, Mike, I'm glad you brought that up because it really was a time of turmoil. I don't want to mitigate it. It's hard to compare to anything nowadays. You had the weed, there was plenty of other harder drugs circulating around. And yes, at one point I was still in high school and watched while some of my friends shot up, which really freaked me out actually.
Yeah.
Because I knew what it was, but I'd never seen anybody do that. And then Vietnam was happening. And everybody knew, at least everybody that I was associated with or friends with or anything, knew that war was just ridiculous, just horrible.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine how evil that war was. And at the same time, the draft was implemented. And they were drafting young men. Basically, you had to go basic training, and then they go over there to fight. So that's hanging over your head. There were student deferments where, you go to college and you could not get drafted. And then somehow people could get out of it in different ways, especially if you're wealthy. I'm not really clear on the exact maneuvering you had to do, but it wasn't easy. So it was really threatening. And, it was the kind of threat that there was nothing good about it. It wasn't exciting. It didn't add any spice to life to have that kind of threat hanging over your head. It was just grim.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that. I'm sure a lot of the people that went over didn't come back because it was one of those wars. And I can't even imagine having almost your freedom taken away to fight for everybody else's freedom when you don't want to do that. But that was what was hanging over your head. Luckily, you didn't get drafted. And then you get a letter from NOLS, and that's where you get invited to instructor courses. And the next right place, right time thing for you was meeting Harvey Carter. For those that don't know, who was he?
Well, Harvey was a really well-known pioneer climber of Colorado from the 50s on into the 60s. He started down in Colorado Springs and then ended up in Aspen as a ski patrolman for years and years, and lived in Aspen. And Aspen has some really good rock climbing outside of town up on Independence Pass, where there was a lot of pioneer climbing to be done, first ascents and stuff. But the main thing Harvey did that really stamped his resume was he would get out to the Utah desert a lot and climb the towers and walls there. He's known mostly as a pioneer of desert climbing.
Okay.
He was a little old-fashioned. He wasn't really with the latest stuff they were doing in Yosemite and that kind of thing. He was kind of like a half a generation behind that. But he was a good climber, and he was happy to mentor young guys, which I was one. And there were many that he would kind of pick up because, especially in those days, if you were going to go climbing, you needed a partner, somebody to belay. So he'd pick up these guys in Aspen. Usually they were a ski patrolman or something like that. So I became friends with him, and more like a mentorship, as did some of my other buddies from those days. And he really taught me the basics of staying alive on a wall. And then eventually I was climbing really all over the country, and my skills got pretty good. And he invited me and a couple of my other younger friends to climb a new route on the Titan, which is a big 900 vertical foot tower in the Utah desert outside of Moab. This is a serious grade 6 real wall climb. And it was definitely the first thing like that I'd ever done. And so we had, a fairly successful trip on that. It took quite a few days to do it. We went back to Aspen at one point and left fixed ropes on the wall and came back and finished it up. But it was a foundational experience for me in terms of my climbing career, which I had this kind of funny climbing career, which, most people know me as a ski mountaineer, but I had this funny, pretty extreme, dedicated climbing career that lasted the peak of it lasted about 7 years. I spent 9-10 months in Yosemite over that amount of time and did some climbing in Alaska and that sort of thing.
I mean, it sounded like you were all rock, then ice, and then you focused on being a ski mountaineer. It was like there's almost 3 chapters of your mountain life.
Yeah, you really could divide it up that way, although they are all integrated. Like when I really started doing a lot of ski mountaineering, my buddies from the climbing days would ask me sometimes, "Hey, Lou, do you still climb?" And I'd usually say, yes. I climb mountains and then I ski down them.
Yeah, it's like you got your skis on your back when you're climbing. It's just a little bit harder.
Yeah. And I was still doing a little bit of rock climbing. I never quit rock climbing, but it wasn't enough to say I was a rock climber. I was too aware of what being a real rock climber was to be calling myself a rock climber when I went out just a couple of times a year. In any case, my career as an alpinist could be divided up that way. And it was a full life for many, many years with those different mountain activities.
And by the mid-70s, you've done your NOLS training. You're an instructor there. In the winters, you're climbing and suffering through the elements. And part of your whole life, I would think, is just suffering. I mean, you had a little bit of suffering at home for sure, but suffering's part of mountaineering in many ways. And I would think boredom in the elements is part of it as well. But when you think about the suffering and being stuck in a tent and things like that, what was the worst of that over your career?
Well, that's a good question. Suffering, the term sufferfest is spoken with a smile, but often experienced, and while it's happening, you don't smile.
Right.
In mountaineering, the important, rewarding mountaineering often includes those sufferfests. And I think probably the hardest time I had with that wasn't hanging from the side of a cliff or something. It was just when I decided to join up with some friends and try a climb in Alaska, where we ended up in our tents for a week being rained on a glacier with this wall kind of dominating above us that we had planned on climbing, but it was obvious it wasn't going to happen, even though we got up on the wall quite a ways. And then as the sun came out and melted the ice and snow even higher on the wall, and it fell on us in these avalanches. And then we rappelled off as the water flowed down the rock in these small waterfalls, and then back to our tents, and then calling the bush plane to come get us. That whole experience, laying in that tent, being bored and wondering what the heck I was doing there, that's what I would call some of the worst suffering I had. And I realized at that time that I wasn't cut out for those expeditions. One of the guys I was with, Michael Kennedy, became a storied alpinist and did some amazing climbs all over the world. And he had a much more organized mind, and he was motivated for the long haul with this sort of thing. And I was just too impulsive to handle that kind of suffering and boredom. So I made a practice of using my skills, which got really highly developed, but making these more fast stabs into the mountains, like speed ascents and one-day trips and that sort of thing.
Okay, the next big thing I'm going to talk about is Denali. And this is like a proving grounds as a mountaineer, and one you need to tick off the list. And you assemble an elite crew of climbers, and you take the northern route, and the plan's to skin up. But something that outlines who you were and what your priorities were at that time is you were able to get to a phone before you climbed Denali, and your partner at that time, she proposes to you. What happens there?
Well, as a youth, I've been embroiled in the common dilemma of, what is romance? What is a relationship with another person? And how does that work with my desire to go on these adventures and just be away and doing this risky stuff? And I'd kind of come to a conclusion that I was just going to climb, and I didn't want to pursue any kind of serious romantic relationships with anybody. And I'd come to that conclusion before the climb when I talked to my partner about that sort of thing, but mostly when I've been in Alaska getting ready for this climb. So we get on the phone. She asked me about marriage, and I just say, hey, I'm going to climb till I die. And that's all I want to do. And that was it. And really after that, I lived up to that stupid little quip and pretty much went after it without any serious relationships for quite a while.
So after that, when you let her know, then it's the Denali climb. And reading about it, it sounded like it was 9 men arguing and suffering. Can you describe that trip?
Yeah, I should have stayed in the relationship with a nice woman. We knew what we were doing to some extent because most of us were NOLS instructors, and we did a lot of 30-day expeditions in the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming. A lot of us had ski experience and plenty of rock climbing experience in the group, but we had never tackled a big Alaskan mountain. And of course, Denali is the big one. And it's a whole different experience in terms of the weather and the amount of risk you have to take, and especially when you do the north side Muldrow Glacier route, which is a lot more serious an undertaking than the southern side, which is the Kahiltna Glacier route and the Washburn Ridge and so forth. So anyway, in those days, you figured strength was in numbers. So we had fully nine guys to do this. And we planned on almost 40 days worth of food and started packing our way into the mountain. And it just was hard. We were carrying these 90-pound packs, but, on the way in, there's mosquitoes and grizzly bears and that kind of thing. And then we get up on the glacier and we're running out of food, and we don't really know if the kind of risk we're taking is appropriate or not. We start having doubts. We get up above the lower glacier, which is the Muldrow, and then onto the Harper Glacier. The route kind of takes a step, and that's where the only technical climbing is. And we actually make it to the summit. Most of us, one guy stayed behind.
Okay.
And we get to the summit, which is kind of anticlimactic because we're all wasted, and it's in the middle of a foggy, not a storm, but a cloud. So there's no view or anything. We're just on this ridge, the top of Denali. Could have been a ridge, behind your house in Aspen or something. We get back down, and then we're stranded in our snow cave by a huge storm. And this went on for a week or more.
Oh, geez.
There's some debate with my cohorts about exactly how many days, but I figured it was, I think in the book, I clock it out at 8, and we're running out of food, and the altitude's starting to affect us more and more, plus the lethargy and the atrophy of just laying around in a snow cave at night, about 19,000 feet. So finally, one guy we designated as our leader. In those days, on those kind of trips, you always designated a real leader.
Okay.
Which isn't as fashionable nowadays. But then that's how we were taught by Petzold and others to operate in the mountains in a group, is you always pick a leader, and you pretty much, they kind of had dictatorial power. You could outvote them, but you were supposed to listen to their idea and pretty much go with it unless you had a lot of good reasons not to.
So it's not a group decision-making mentality. He's the alpha.
Yeah, it was kind of odd. Kind of an amalgam of both, really.
Okay.
But much more so than nowadays when groups pretty much discuss things together and there's no real designated group leader. But anyway, our group leader, John Wisnat, he was talking in the snow cave, and we were talking about how we were running out of food and things were going to go from bad to worse really quickly. And he just said, we've got to get out of here and we got to do it. whatever the storm's doing, we're just going to go. And we all agreed, and we managed to crawl out of the snow cave and get our gear on and start down the Harper Glacier. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when I thought back on it, we were like an inch from death.
Huh.
And I felt it up there, but, we were so involved in survival that I didn't feel that much fear. But over the years, as I've looked back on it, I've realized how close we were to dying up there in the Harper Glacier, just like other groups had. Indeed, a few years prior, it wasn't that long before we were up there, that there was a famous expedition where most of the fellows on the climb died in a storm. And we were in the exact same place in the exact same kind of storm.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so it was pretty serious, but talk about a formative experience in terms of, learning about glaciers and travel on that kind of mountain and the judgment calls and dealing with risk, spending 40-something days in that kind of situation was a huge thing for me in terms of development as a mountaineer.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and I'm starting this out with outdoor research. First and foremost, when I signed on with OR, I knew there wasn't an outerwear brand on the market that performs as well as what OR has been putting out in the marketplace for over 40 years. That's what happens when you test your gear in the absolutely terrible, soggy conditions that we can get here in the Pacific Northwest. As we all know, days in the mountains are always more fun when you're warm and dry, and that's what people trust OR to deliver time after time. I'll tell you, on cold days, I live in my men's Snow Crew down jacket. This is hands down the warmest jacket I've ever owned. And for those standard Northwest days, I rock the Snow Crew jacket and pant, which keeps me comfortable. And it's one of those fits where if you don't see me ski, I look like a pro. Really, what's rad about OR is the style that they've been bringing to the table lately. While mountaineers have always sworn by OR's quality and performance, now athletes like legend Mark Abma, world champion Troy Podmilsack, and X Games gold medalist Zoe Atkin are making OR gear look cooler than ever. I've been loving OR products since I first bought my outdoor research rain jacket when I moved to Seattle in 2000. And I know you will too. If you want to be warm and dry and look cool this season, head on over to outdoorresearch.com and see what I'm talking about. My final sponsor is Best Day Brewing. And with snow season right around the corner, skiers, snowboarders, weekend warriors, tubers, sledders, snowbikers, snowmobilers, you get it. The doers of winter are starting to get ready to shred. And post-shred, it's all about après. And this year, do après right. Forget about the calories, forget about the alcohol, and forget about getting in trouble on the way home. Because with a beer from Best Day Brewing, you know you'll get all the flavor of your favorite beer without the alcohol. Whether it be the West Coast IPA, a hazy IPA, a Kolsch, the Electro Lime, or my new favorite flavor, the Natural Pills, you won't have to worry about anything but having your best day ever when you have a best day. Blind taste tests prove that you won't be able to taste the difference between your favorite beer and a best day. I mean, the only difference you'll notice is how good you feel in the morning, and you're going to remember what you did last night, which is almost as refreshing as a best day. So next time you're at the store, pick up a 6-pack of Best Day, or you can always buy some on Amazon or at bestdaybrewing.com, and you can thank me later. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. Speaking of your development as a mountaineer, I'm going to pass over your rock and ice climbing years of your life. And people that want that detail should read your book, Avalanche Dreams. We don't have enough time to get into them, but really, you're known as almost the godfather of backcountry skiing here in the U.S., and this is a ski-focused podcast. And when did your mountaineering start to become all about ski mountaineering?
I would say two things were going together. I'd say getting into the late 1960s, when I was thinking a lot about climbing, I was in Aspen in the winter, and I really wanted to get out into the mountains. And there's a chapter in the book about my first experience solo skiing up to a place called Conundrum Hot Springs, which is in the heart of the Elk Mountains, full-on avalanche terrain, going up there by myself, and I think it was February. So the two things were happening concurrently. The book maybe sort of implies a shift, and I guess I did, because I didn't do as much rock climbing after a while, but the whole time during my climbing career, I was also ski touring and going to huts and that sort of thing. So I can't really draw a marker line. What happened more is the two things had their phases, let's say, in life. And for a while, I was more concerned with the vertical of climbing. And then as I did more and more skiing and I lost interest in climbing, then I became more of a ski mountaineer. And in my book, I get into a lot more introspection kind of about how I got burned out on climbing and ended up seeking the faster, more fluid movement of skiing and that sort of thing. But there's no real good dividing line I can come up with. It was more an evolution, and I think I make that pretty clear in my book.
Fair enough. And it seems like in your personal life, and there's no judgment from me here, but it sounds like recreational drugs kind of creep up again. And one thing I've heard from drugs at that time was the Owsley acid made for the Grateful Dead was the best acid ever. And people wear t-shirts today that just say Owsley. And if you see that shirt, you took that acid. I'm guessing you've tripped a few different times in your life. Was that the best stuff that you ever took? And just like people say?
Oh man, I've never had a question like that in an interview.
Well, it's interesting.
Acid connoisseur. No, I can't remember really having that kind of discernment over those drugs.
Okay.
I do remember, the reputation, and this was, we're getting out of sequence on the timeline here because the days of that kind of drug use were back before I'd gotten in that Highland Bowl avalanche.
Yeah, it's a few years before when you broke your leg, I think.
Yeah, it was back more in the early 70s when I first broke my leg. And yeah, my culture in Aspen was, a lot of us were about microdosing and getting up on the ski hill and having a great time. So that's kind of the drug culture I was involved in. It wasn't like hard drugs,
sure,
addictions, but they were nonetheless weren't good for your head.
No, just hallucinogens, tripping your face off. Did you actually integrate that into your skiing? And does that increase the danger level when your eyes are like frisbees when you're skiing down the mountain?
Yeah, I try to imply that in the book, that it's, I might have gotten into a God complex where I thought I was a great skier, but I was probably just a hack. A stoned out hack heading down the hill. But the crew I was involved with, most of us were able to keep it under control, and I respect that. And I'm still friends with a lot of those people, and most of them have done pretty well.
Well, I don't see hallucinogens as something that's going to ruin your life unless you're doing them on a daily basis. You weren't definitely doing that, so whatever.
Yeah.
The next big move for you is Crested Butte. You work for Outward Bound there. Is that like the JV version of the NOLS stuff that you came up on?
Not really. Outward Bound had a different educational philosophy in that they were more concerned about personal development, self-actualization, using risk or perceived risk to bring people to a different state of consciousness so they could learn about themselves and getting along with other people. And NOLS was more about learning the skill set you needed to guide people while you're doing Outward Bound. And that's how Petzold founded NOLS. Is he started with Outward Bound, and he realized there weren't as many good instructors as he needed or as Outward Bound needed. So he started NOLS to train instructors for Outward Bound. That was his first implementation of his NOLS philosophy. And then NOLS grew from there, and then NOLS kind of backtracked a little bit, and they got a little more summer campy and adventure oriented, which I don't say that in a disparaging way. It's just the way that it all evolved. And then Outward Bound stuck with its pretty much come here, do some rappelling, do some climbing. You may never do it again in your life, but you're going to have a great experience, and you learn something about yourself and maybe meet some new people and go on to life from there and be more successful in your life as it progresses. And I liked that about Outward Bound. I thought it was really cool to see the mountains and have that a kind of effect on people, where you could go out there and have these reasonably safe but adventurous experiences and maybe hang out with some people of like mind who are really positive and feeling the good vibe of the mountains. And then you get that benefit, and maybe it would have a healing effect if you had some problems with depression, or you were a youth that was maybe having some behavioral problems or something like that. And when I was working for him, I saw that work. I saw that whole function prove out. And I thought it was really cool. In fact, over the years, I've regretted that I didn't keep working for those guys, but that wasn't my personality. I like to do something like that for a few years and then move on to something else.
And when you were doing that whole thing, it sounds like you eventually went to go lead winter courses in Leadville, which is brutal because of the altitude there. But in the days leading up to those courses, what made you come up with the idea or made you want to climb and ski 30 peaks in 30 days? And did all your friends think you were crazy, or were they just as crazy as you?
Oh, to varying degrees. There were some crazier than me and some less crazy. I might have been on the crazy scale. I was maybe an 8. There was a few 9s.
Okay.
I think, you have to ask my buddies from back then. But yeah, self-diagnosis is hard. But no, I'd been doing a lot of ski mountaineering. Like I said, I transitioned into it, and a lot of that transition happened while I was working for Outward Bound. Although I'd actually gone off and done some good climbs too at the same time. I was looking through my journal and realized that I'd been cruising around doing some stuff, even a few wall climbs, which I'd totally forgotten about. But in any case, let's put it this way. I developed my ski skills to where I could pretty much handle most of what you could get in Colorado.
Okay.
And this was because, I'd spent formative years in Aspen, skiing Aspen Mountain, where there were these raging groups of Rat Pack skiers, that were world class.
Yeah, everybody's good there.
Yeah, I never was a world class skier. I started late and had other interests, the climbing and that sort of thing. But, I became a pretty good skier. So I knew I could handle this stuff, and I really liked it. I liked getting out there by myself and climbing up a peak and launching off the top. The experience was so much one of freedom and individual power in your environment and being able to blend with your environment that I became a lot more addicted to that than I was to rock climbing, even though I'd totally been a rock climbing addict as well, which my friends can attest to. So anyway, working for Outward Bound all winter, slogging around the mountains with the students was it was a lot brutal. It was cold, and you're living out in this environment where you're digging snow caves and trying to snow camp. A lot of winter Outward Bound is just about snow camping, which when you're new to it is quite a grand adventure. But when you're doing it day after day, just for the point of experiencing it with some of your students, it can get pretty boring and brutal. Oh, and the other part of which I mentioned in the book, and the main point of this deal, is that a lot of the students that we take on these Outward Bound winter courses weren't good skiers. Some of them didn't even ski at all. We had to basically teach them during the course how to get down a moderate hill, snow plowing or sidestepping or whatever. And that part of it really got to me because I was a good enough skier to where we'd get up on top of these smaller mountains or up just a slope behind camp. And I'd want to just take off and get some skiing done. And instead, we were basically a lot of times leading a group of novices down the hill.
So you're a ski school.
Yeah, basically just operating as sort of this backcountry ski school situation. And some guys had the personality for it, and, they liked it. And I liked my students. They were always wonderful, interesting people. But I certainly didn't like being relegated to the role of a ski instructor for beginners. So as spring rolled around with the attendant Colorado corn snow season and the mountain snowpack firming up and getting to the point where you could do your ski mountaineering, I asked the course director, Denny Hogan, if he would allow me to, the next course we had I asked him if he would select out the intermediate to advanced skiers, and then they could be on the course that me and my assistant were teaching, so that we'd have real skiers and we could really do some ski mountaineering. Now, this wasn't normal Outward Bound practice, because what they do before is they wanted to always mix people. Sometimes we called it the churn, where when you got your students, you basically form your groups out of a hat by drawing names out of a hat. And it was supposed to enhance the growth experience, having this really diverse group. And part of the diversity was the skiing skill levels. So I don't know. I wasn't into the philosophy of diversity or anything like that in those days. I just wanted to ski, so I don't want to put anything on that. And I do admire Outward Bound in terms of how they arrange things so that people get the most value out of their courses. But anyway, me and my assistant, Tim Lane, were allowed to select out the students who had the most ski experience. And we went off and we had a spring ski mountaineering course that really was kind of at another level. And at the same time, I'd come up with this idea that I don't know where this came from, because I've never been a list keeper type of person, or maybe I am because of what happened in the future with the 14ers. But I decided I would ski 30 high peaks in Colorado in 30 days. So during the Outward Bound course, I started hacking my way on that, skiing 1 or 2 peaks a day as we were up in the high country. And then as soon as we got back to base camp, the civilized base camp, instead of resting, I would just get up right away the next morning and go ski another peak or 2, and then another one, and then back out on the course. You know, we might be camped some distance from where the peaks were, but I would get up early in the morning and boogie up the trail and get to the place where I could climb one of these things. There were basically 13ers, some 12,000 foot peaks, 13ers, a few 14ers.
So you're an absolute animal at this time. I mean, in the book, you said one day that you got done teaching a course, and then sometimes, or one time, I think you did 3 peaks in a day, which is just absolutely insane to me.
Yeah, I was more of an animal than I gave myself credit for, but I really did have some skills and some cardio fitness that was exceptional. And over the years, I realized that, and I started to really revel in it. That feeling of being able to just keep going forever. Guys, it's just an amazing feeling. And, you know, at this point in my life, I'm 72 years old and I don't have that anymore. So I can really look back and appreciate that and the kind of gift it was to have that kind of physique and be able to move through the mountains in that kind of style. It was a really, really cool thing to experience. And that's what I was applying to that project. And I wasn't cheating either. I mean, I would really ski the peak, and I didn't go all the way down to the highway, but I'd go down a ways. And when I climbed the next one, it would be a 2,000 or 3,000 vert, you know, good stiff climbs.
For sure. And so we've been talking about your life and times, and they're super interesting, but I need to get to you climbing and seeing all of the Colorado's 54 14ers before we run out of time. How did that idea come to be?
Well, what happened with that is I was living near Aspen, and I've been still doing quite a bit of ski mountaineering. And I had one friend named John Quinn, and he and I had become ski partners. We'd done a couple of ski traverses through the Elk Mountains in the middle of winter, which were brutal and weird things to do. And he was one of the few guys that would come along with me and do that stuff. So we became really good friends. And then he went off to college, and I was married by then to my wife, Lisa, and living, like I said, living near Aspen. And I got a phone call from John in the spring. I forgot which year that was, but
1987, I think it was.
87, yeah. He just said, hey, you know, Lou, I'm burned out on school and I'd like to come visit and do some ski mountaineering. How about we ski some 14ers? And I don't know really where he got the idea. I mean, skiing 14ers in those days was not like, it wasn't a big goal. Almost all of them had been skied at one time or another. And outside of Aspen, there's the Maroon Bells and Pyramid Peak, and they're famous 14ers. And they indeed, especially the Maroon Bells have, even in those days, had several different ski routes on them, extreme ski routes that were pretty stiff. And in any case, John calls. I say, yeah, let's do it. I was doing some guidebook writing at the time and doing some carpentry, and I was able to take some time off. So we went out. He had a Jeep Wagoneer, which was the perfect truck for a road trip. You could sleep lengthwise on the bench seats. We didn't need a van, or I guess it was a van of sorts. And we skied 12 14ers in a couple of weeks. And as we were skiing them, I'd written in my journal something. I had it around here somewhere to dig up, but I can't find it these days. I'd written something about how cool it would be to ski all the 14ers. But that idea wasn't really strong in my head. In fact, I'd forgotten that I'd even thought about it by the time we were having a beer back at our mobile home near Aspen. And then John's sitting there and he just mentions, hey, you know, that was a great trip. Wouldn't it be cool if you went and skied all the 14ers? Or tried to. I mean, you know, there were several that hadn't been skied and some we didn't know if they could be skied. So he's talking about that, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, that sounds like a great list project. So I guess I was a list guy. So in any case, I started the project then. I went out and skied a few more 14ers that spring and then started banging them off over the next years.
So you get 17 that first year. When the season ends, you get your first book deal for the 14er project. And while you've written other books, was this the first time like money was guaranteed and you knew stuff was coming in?
Well, I wasn't guaranteed money from the books.
Okay.
With my 14er guidebooks, I think we arranged a really moderate advance. You know, it's just symbolic, like $500 or something.
Okay.
And no, what was going on then is my wonderful, supportive wife, Lisa, had a really good job. And so we were financially doing fine. We lived in a mobile home. We had just our lot rent. We owned the home. And when I was working, I was a carpenter and I was making really good money. So we were actually saving money like crazy. So taking some time off to do that was not a big deal. And then, you know, mountaineering and climbing in your own region can be really affordable. You know, all you need is some gasoline and a few days off.
True.
It's not like an expedition where you have to come up with huge amounts of cash.
True. And I guess while you're in the middle of this project, that's when Stumpy puts out Blizzard of Aahhs.
Oh, yeah.
That changes the whole way that athletes are looked at, I think, in that era. Like Plake and Hatterup and Schmidt, they were able to get paid by just skiing and not competing and not racing. Does that inspire you to start making calls and sending letters and trying to get money from the brands?
Yeah. The Blizzard of Aahhs was a huge deal. We all know that. It was so wonderful to see kind of that adventure skiing, let's call it. I don't like to call it extreme skiing because a lot of the skiing they were doing wasn't what we call extreme skiing.
Sure.
But that kind of exuberant adventure skiing, just having a blast, letting them fly, you know, it just that whole attitude. And there's something different about it. And I think maybe it was just that it wasn't Warren Miller for a change.
Yeah.
You know? But in any case, as we all know, that film resonated like crazy, and it was probably the most influential ski film of all time, maybe. At least modern ski film. There were a few films in the 30s and 40s, right, that were seminal ski movies that are black and white, silent pictures and stuff that showed people what skiing was. But anyway, that film came out, and I was in the middle of my project, and I'd really felt like I was doing something that I knew was really cool and a good project that was beneficial to the ski mountaineering community. But I didn't feel like I was very validated. You know, it was like, what am I doing? Who else is doing this kind of stuff around here? Even though in Europe, you know, that kind of skiing had gotten pretty popular by then.
Yes.
Skiing steep terrain. But it hadn't caught on as much in the U.S., although it had to some extent. Let's not forget that. But anyway, the film came out, and then I was like, well, maybe if I'm skiing all the 14ers, maybe I can be one of these guys that at least gets a free pair of skis or something.
Sure.
But as it turned out, I wasn't very good at self-promotion. I actually sent out some press releases. I got a little mention in Powder Magazine and a few things like that. And I think I got a free hat, and a company called Mountainsmith gave me a pack. But I like to joke with Lisa, I always joked with her that you just couldn't eat nylon and it wouldn't put gasoline in your tank.
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, I was a team manager for a while, and when I'd be like, we can't put you on, we can send you some skis, though, I would get that from people like, yeah, but skis don't pay my rent, and I get that. But some people sell their skis and they could pay the rent, but whatever, you weren't getting enough free backpacks to do that. Thinking about your project, I mean, you tick all of these off and people can read that in the book, but towards the end of it, your wife is pregnant, and how difficult is it for you to try to want to finish this whole thing when you've got a kid?
It was difficult emotionally. You know, I only had a few peaks to go by the time we were going to have a child. But in those days, there was a lot more risk involved. I mean, we didn't have cell phones when I was finishing up. I tried to carry a little handheld ham radio that I could call somebody on if I was out there either with a friend and injured or, Lord forbid, by myself. So I really felt like I was out there sometimes. I mean, like could have been down in Antarctica in the middle of the ice cap or something.
Yeah.
So I had some second thoughts about doing it, and I just had to stick with the goal. And part of that the reason why I was able to do that is Lisa was supportive of the whole deal. She was always had this ultra confidence in me, and she'd seen how I operated in the mountains because I'd been her mentor when she moved here from California and took up these sports as well. I was basically showing her how to do all the stuff and how to operate in the mountains. So she knew that I had this ability to be as safe as anyone, and I wasn't doing anything that was exceptionally stupid.
Yeah.
It was all pretty calculated. And indeed, most of the peaks, like I mentioned before, had already been skied at least once. So I knew, where there might be a route or how they were done. So she was supportive. And also, her pregnancy, she loved being pregnant. And she was really just involved with the feeling of being a mother. And I expressed that in the book in various ways, where she wasn't kicking me out of the house or anything, but she also had something else on her mind besides what her husband was doing out in the mountains. There was a coming child. But she, the bottom line is, with this kind of project, if you're married, if your wife is supportive or your husband, that's what's going to make it happen. Otherwise, the marriage might not happen anymore.
Yeah, true. Well, I would say a common theme in your book is that throughout your life, it was like you almost were always seeking danger and almost pain to feel alive. Would that be fair to say?
No, my approach with climbing and ski mountaineering as the years rolled was one more about an experience of mastery and skill. I really, really enjoyed blending with the hills and performing at my top level, using my athletic ability and feeling almost like I was part of the landscape. So it wasn't as much about pain or suffering as it was about, let's say, the finer things in life. And I had some really peak experiences in that way that went way beyond suffering and pain. Just, being on the side of a mountain and with the two skis on steep terrain and suddenly feeling like you're just on the side of the planet, working your way down through maybe a 45, 50 degree slope and almost feeling the planet rotate under your feet and suddenly visualizing yourself as almost ant-like on the side of maybe a picnic basket or something where you're trying to seek out a sugar crystal. Those were the kind of peak experiences that I was seeking. And then getting more on a basic level, I enjoy the idea of accomplishing a list. It was really had a lot of meaning to me. And I also thought maybe this was good for my writing career, write some guidebooks and this and that. But I wasn't that concerned about that part of it. I already had a career as a carpenter, and I can do all the guiding I wanted as my guidebooks came out. You write a guidebook, you can always get guide clients. And in those days, there wasn't as much emphasis on being certified and that sort of thing. And I had my NOLS instructor certification and first aid training and stuff. So by the standards of that day, I was qualified.
All right, Lou. Well, I'm going to say that's the body of our podcast, but I still have one segment left, and I call it Inappropriate Questions. I get someone that you know to ask 3 questions, and they can be anything. And this week, I was able to get another badass mountaineer to ask you some questions. A guy I worked with at K2, a legend in Utah and all over the country, the author of The Shooting Gallery, Andrew McLean, to ask you the questions. And are you ready for question number 1 from Andrew?
Sure. I'm always ready for something from Andrew.
All right, here we go.
Hey, Lou. Yeah, I was wondering, throughout your long history of climbing and skiing expeditions, what is the longest you've gone without changing your underwear?
That's a great question, actually. And I'm sure it was that Denali 40-something day trip. I would imagine me and the other guys too, we probably went for 2 or 3 weeks without changing our underwear.
That is gross, but that is what you do on the mountain. I will jump into question number 2 from Andrew.
Lou, how many marriages have you performed, and are the couples still together?
3 marriages, Andrew, yours and a couple of other ones. And yes, the couples are all together. I don't know if there's much meaning in that. It might be just pure luck because 3 is not very many. But those were always wonderful affairs. And as an officiant, I'm always available, provided the traveling isn't too onerous.
All right, there you go. Anybody can get Lou. No, not anybody can get Lou to get them married. But, if you know him well, I bet you he would officiate your wedding. Here we go with his third inappropriate question.
Between a lifetime as a vegan or a lifetime as a teleskier, which would you choose?
Oh, man. That's like a Faustian bargain or something like that. Devil's choice. I would think I would choose to be a vegan.
There you go, teleskiers. He would never eat meat again if he had to ski teleskis all day long, every day of his life. And that would normally be our final inappropriate question, but Andrew said he had a bonus question for you, so I'm going to bring it up.
Sure.
Which has better snow, Colorado or Utah?
My answer would be a little more involved. I think in one sense, we have better snow because our high altitude corn snow season is more robust. But when it comes to powder skiing, there's still nothing like the Wasatch. So there you go.
So that's Inappropriate Questions, and that's our podcast. And when you look at your life and times, you're one badass mountain man who's done so much. And we only touched on just a little bit of your life and times up until like the 90s. And after that, there was Denali with the family, creating Wild Snow and so much writing. And then you've inspired so many people like Chris Davenport, I'm sure Cody Townsend, and so many others with the things that you were doing. And when you think about it, with the gear that you were doing it with, it is so much harder than what people did today. And that makes your accomplishments so much more impressive. And you're looked at as the pioneer of backcountry skiing in the US. And you've lived and suffered more than almost anybody else I've had on the show. Everyone should buy your book, Avalanche Dreams. And everyone who ventures out in the backcountry should buy you a beer or a non-alcoholic beer. That would be Best Day, which is one of my sponsors. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It was really fun.
So that was time with Lou Dawson, and he really is a living legend with an incredible perspective on the mountains, the world, really everything we chatted about. He didn't just spit out answers, he really thought about what he was going to say, and not that he was calculated, but he was intentional. And really, what do I know about ski mountaineering? That kind of type 2 fun isn't what I'm all about. So going into this one, I was worried that Lou was going to think I was some random kook interviewing him. And sure, maybe I was. But Lou didn't make me feel that way. He might be one of those guys who's a closeted introvert, but all the Outward Bound and NOLS training built Lou into one of those dudes that can not only do gnarly stuff in the mountains, but he can chat about it and put it in layman's terms so anyone can understand what he's talking about. Not every mountain badass is like that. So I was stoked to get time with a legend, and I really hope this is a different and awesome interview for him. Now I'm going to read my review of the week. If you're going to take the time to write something for me, I'm going to read the best one each week, and here's what I thought was the best this week. It comes from Waters Guy. It's a 5-star rating titled How Podcasts Should Be. I don't normally leave reviews, but after doing a road trip across western Colorado and listening to Mr. Powell nonstop for several hours, I was compelled to leave a stellar review. You can tell he does his homework before the interviews, and the research pays off. He's asking probing questions that need to be asked and going deeper than most, even if it gets emotional. He really paints the whole picture in an interview and allows you to understand where each one of these extreme superstars fit in their sport. The Powell movement puts a light on a culture that has a story to tell. The stories are always interesting, even if you're not a ski fan, and Mike puts together a truly great podcast. Thanks, buddy. I look forward to your next show. Thanks, Waters Guy. I really appreciate that review. It means a lot. And something I forgot to mention a little bit earlier in the outro is that Lou Dawson's book, Avalanche Dreams, is the perfect Christmas gift for the mountain lover in your world. But there's other people who make even better Christmas gifts, and those are my incredible sponsors. While I can't do this podcast without you listening, I can't do it without these incredible brands supporting me putting together this history of snow and beyond. The brands that make the podcast happen are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Best Day Brewing, Thermic and Dissent Socks, and Stanley. Have a great week, everyone.